day, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And my name is Kobie Brandt. I'm the ICLEI Africa Regional Director, but also Deputy Secretary General of ICLEI, and will be moderating today's very high-level webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome you all, speakers, panelists, and attendees, on behalf of ICLEI and especially ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre and our partners, to the third webinar in our series, From Agreement to Action. Before we start the webinar, I just want to cover a few of the house rules. All participants will remain muted during the webinar, and please also note that the webinar is being recorded and that by participating in the webinar, you give consent to being recorded. Today's webinar on finance. What a topic. Finance, we here aim to show today, in a space of 1 hour, the opportunities and initiatives for increasing investment in and funding for biodiversity action at local and subnational level. It will explore the importance of collective actions and synergies for raising new and additional resources, raising the importance of the private sector investments in biodiversity, and mobilizing the introduction of innovative finance mechanisms, such as payment for ecosystem services, blended finance, green bonds, and perhaps those we still yet to invent. Given the theme of International Day for Biodiversity, Biological Diversity 2023, which was From Agreement to Action, Building Back Biodiversity, which was celebrated in May this year, with its main focus on implementation, action, whole of government, whole of society collaboration, ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre are hosting a leading series of webinars under the theme From Agreement to Action, the key role of subnational and local governments in the Global Biodiversity Framework implementation, with the support from the following partners, which I recognize with great gratitude. Joining us here today, UNEP, thank you. Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, who's always welcomed the local and subnational voice within their processes. Thank you for doing that. International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, our long-standing partner. Ever since ICLEI started working on biodiversity, IUCN has been there side by side with us. The Committee of Regions in Europe, and always, what a strong, fantastic partnership we have with the European Union through the Committee of Regions actions that are so inspiring, and our long-standing partner, Regions 4. The purpose of this webinar series is to maintain the momentum from COP15. You will remember the vibrancy, the energy in the room in Montreal in December last year, when the GBF was presented and how it was embraced by so many. We want that momentum to mobilize other cities and regions to come on board, and let's walk the talk towards COP16. These webinars will also provide an opportunity to inspire each other, share information on actions being taken by local and subnational governments to contribute to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and its plan of action, to engage local and subnational governments in implementing the GBF. With the webinars, we aim to build commitments towards COP16 in 2024 and ultimately to reach the 2030 targets, very ambitious targets, and the 2050 goals, very ambitious too. As you can see, we have a great lineup of speakers, and we deeply thank everyone for taking your time to join us here today. The GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework, will be implemented through activities at the national level with supporting actions at the subnational and local levels. We need to support our national governments to attain these targets. However, the resources for implementation are limited. Therefore, the mobilization of adequate financial resources is critical for achieving the goals and targets of the framework. Target 12 calls for substantially and progressively increasing the levels of financial resources from all sources to implement national biodiversity strategies and action plans by mobilizing at least $200 billion by the year 2030. Just 6 years from now almost, including by increasing domestic resource mobilization facilitated through national biodiversity finance plans, leveraging private finance, promoting blended finance, and encouraging the private sector to invest in biodiversity, including through impact funds and other instruments. And lastly, optimizing co-benefits and synergies for finance targeting the biodiversity and other climate crises. According to the UNEP State of Finance for Nature report, more than half of the world's GDP is generated in industries dependent on nature and ecosystem services, and nature-based solutions comprise more than a third of the most cost-effective solutions to climate catastrophes, potentially sequestering up to 1.7 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. That's huge. Cities are responsible for 80% of the world's GDP, making them, of course, critical players in the global economy. And the same can be said for regional governments or states like California. Nature-based solutions in cities presents a fast-growing, time-sensitive opportunity to reshape the way investments are made in nature. Therefore, we urgently need to transition towards innovative finance solutions that will substantially increase investment in nature and nature-based solutions quite quickly to meet our infrastructure challenges and needs, and will lead to nature-positive development. We are rapidly if we are going to actually rapidly double finance flows to nature-based solutions, we have to halt biodiversity loss, significantly contribute to the reduction of emissions, and restore close to 1 billion hectares of degraded land. One of the key issues identified in the adoption of the GBF is the urgent need to channel funds from developed to developing countries, in particular our least developing countries, small island states, and countries with economies in transition, to assist with implementation. To address this, the 7th Assembly of the GEF, Global Environmental Facility, ratified its Council decision to establish the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, which is new. While this step has been heralded as a game changer, the new fund is $40 million short today of the target agreed at COP15 in Montreal in December last year. So we've got a way to go there. But it's a very big step in the right direction. Decision 15.7, resource mobilization, addresses this urgent need and also refers to target 14 to ensure that biodiversity issues are integrated into policies, regulations, and planning within and across all levels of government, emphasizing the importance and the availability of adequate financial resources to be allocated to the implementation of the GBF. The CBD is the only Rio Convention that has a dedicated decision on multi-level governance, Decision 1512, which is fantastic for us, on engagement with subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities to enhance the implementation of the GBF. This decision includes a plan of action, and there are many aspects to this plan of action that speak to finance as well. So our speakers here today will present different perspectives and initiatives that illustrate how cities and subnational governments are rising to the challenge to invest in local action for nature towards achieving these very targets, as well as some of the challenges they face and the innovative solutions they have found or they want to find. So I'm now introducing our very first speaker today. You've seen all the names, but here I'm very happy to introduce to you today Sharon Gill, head of the UNEP Cities Unit industry and economy of the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. And Sharon, thank you very much for joining us. UNEP is doing such outstanding work for so many years already in this field, specifically around multi-level governance as well. So UNEP's State of Finance for Nature report highlights the need for significantly increased finance and investment in nature-based solutions. How does this report and the work UNEP is doing on nature finance relates to cities and subnational governments? Is it included? Do you speak directly around cities and nature or subnational governments when you talk about nature? Can you share with us any findings from your work or how to optimize this opportunity at our level of government, the subnational level of government, and scale out investments? Sharon, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Kobe, and for your kind words. For those who do not know the State of Finance for Nature report series, it is a report that UNEP produces annually to estimate how much we need in investment in nature to keep to our global targets, particularly to keep within 1.5 degrees. Essentially, it's a gap report on what we need in terms of nature investment. So many of us in UNEP are actually read and write depressing reports for a living. That's a joke internally. And we also have a joke where we say we're very good at documenting humanity's failures. And I have to say that in the State of Finance for Nature, we do need to have, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So now, according to the report, we need 384 billion annually in NBS investment by 2025 and 485 billion to reach our goals by 2025. And if we look further to 2030 to keep to the 1.5 degree target, we would need 484 billion per year. So 384, 484. Current finance flows are only at 154 billion per year. So much smarter people have gone through the substantial amount of economic gymnastics which are, to my understanding, quite conservative estimates, meaning this is the minimum that we need to get to achieve what we need. Bottom line, we are far from our current target. So what do we need to do? To complement the global report, our team and UNEP, within UNEP, thought that we really need to talk to local governments because that's where the action is. We all know that cities are drivers of the economy. We have here some of our states and local governments are the ones that actually drive the economies of their regions. So if we are going to invest more in nature, we need to look at how can we convince our cities and our regions to invest more in nature. So especially since the report also looks at how public sector spending is dominant. So it's 83% in the current estimates. So where does that where is that money coming from? Where's the tax money coming from? It's from cities. So we came up with a complementary report, the State of Finance for Nature for cities. But here's the thing, when we started delving into, we wanted it to be part of the main report, but data on urban investments was very difficult to disentangle from the bigger numbers. Because many times investments in nature are coupled in the city budgets are coupled with bigger infrastructure investments. So it's very hard to identify which ones are nature investments, which are broader urban infrastructure investments, and we're working on that. And we hope that we can work with colleagues in the panel, with ICLEI. We're working with the University of Pennsylvania to actually disentangle the data a little bit better and to really tease out, because we have here in our panel leaders in nature investment. So how do we make that seen by national government to also inspire national government to invest. So in UNEP, we strongly support and believe that cities are an important part of the equation in nature investments. So we are working with the IUCN and with ICLEI on the Global Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Fund, supporting catalytic projects aimed at creating widespread implementation of ecosystem-based adaptation. We have the UNEP-led Urban Shift program, which includes WRI, C40, ICLEI, among other partners, which identifies, this is funded by the Global Environment Facility, and it identifies investment-ready nature-based solutions projects and realigns budgets to better incorporate nature-based solutions in city planning. And more recently, we have been working on what we call pushing for a generation restoration together with under the UN Decade on Ecosystems Restoration. ICLEI is very much a part of that. And the call here is, and I find this very interesting because under the UN Decade, it's the first time that urban ecosystems are recognized as a pillar for restoration, for nature. And I think that's very exciting because it's showing that urban ecosystems are ecosystems of their own that need full attention. So, but of course, we know that local government, city-states cannot do it alone. A lot of the funding is at national level. We need public-private partnerships. We need national government to work with us. And I don't have all the answers to that at the moment, but definitely UNEP is here to work with you to hopefully we will measure progress towards our goals in the next State of Finance for Nature reports.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And it's also, you know, these reports keep us all grounded, and the effort and time and data and everything that goes in there, it's so well grounded, and it gives us direction. So thank you very much. And also for pointing out that cities and regional governments, states, provinces, whatever they're called, prefectures in Japan, they have a lot of capital within themselves. And it's about how do they budget? You know, do they take nature positive responses into account? So thank you for reminding us that a lot of the funding actually sits within these subnational governments around the world. I now would like to introduce to you Robbie Beaver, Councillor of Bettemberg in Luxembourg, but also a very strategic and important member of the European Committee of Regions, very powerful organization. And Robbie has been a long-standing advocate for local and subnational governments within the EU context, but also globally. Robbie, the EU biodiversity strategy aims to halt biodiversity loss by 2030. You made a strong call when you recently you recently called for the urgent local action at the 7th Summit of Subnational Governments and Cities there in Montreal, where we were together. How is the European Committee of Regions ensuring that the EU regions are adequately financed to meet these ambitious targets? One thing to commit, the other thing is how do we finance, especially in regions and cities with varying economic capacities? And is enough being done to mobilize increased resources for local biodiversity action? If not, how can this be addressed? Robbie, the floor is yours. Please give us your wisdom, as you always do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kobe, and all my friends from ICLEI and Regions 4, and also CBD and UNEP. Let me just start to say that the European Committee of the Regions is the European Union's Assembly of Regional and Local Representatives, and our mission is to represent and promote the interests of local and regional authorities in relation to the European decision-making process. So from our Brussels headquarters, the committee ensures that decisions taken at the European level include the point of view, challenges and perspectives of local and other subnational authorities in the EU. This is important because we are the closest level of government to the citizens, and we know best the context, the circumstances, difficulties, opportunities of our territories and communities. And as just ago Sharon Gill said, cities, municipalities and subnational governments, we are the drivers also in environmental and biodiversity matters and implementation of these policies on the local levels. So the Committee of the Regions serves as a platform where regional and local authorities can come together to share best practices, exchange ideas, and align their efforts towards common goals. As you may know, at EU level, the European Green Deal is a landmark strategy that is guiding the Committee of the Regions' action in the field of nature protection, restoration, and addressing biodiversity loss. Just to mention that I also had been the rapporteur on the new EU law on restoration of nature, and I think it's a very important initiative of the European Union. So the Committee of the Region established the working group Green Deal Going Local, aiming at facilitating the implementation of the European Green Deal on the ground and putting cities and regions at the core of the EU strategy. Several debates and information sessions have been organized to discuss practical solutions to bend the curve of biodiversity loss at local level, or to ensure that cities and regions are well represented at the international level, such as in the Convention for Biological Diversity. Members of the Committee of the Region meet regularly in plenary session in Brussels to discuss and adopt opinions, reports, and resolutions. These resolutions are then sent to other EU institutions for their considerations, and members of the European Parliament, commissioners, members of the Council, and representatives of the EU Presidency are invited to the plenary to discuss issues of particular concern to regions and cities. With these actions, the Committee of the Regions has created a space for local and regional authority, policymakers, experts, and stakeholders to collaborate on biodiversity-related issues. And I personally can confirm that we succeeded in having the European Parliament and commissioners being now aware and seeing that local and subnational governments are allies in also in environmental matters. So furthermore, the committee organizes workshops, consultations, and debates focused on biodiversity, bringing together policymakers, practitioners, and experts to exchange knowledge and experience. These events provide a platform for regions to showcase what we are doing and to establish partnership that can attract investments from various sources. Though its advocacy efforts, knowledge sharing initiatives, and policy recommendations, the European Committee of the Regions act as a catalyst for collaboration between cities and regions within the EU, facilitating the exchange of expertise, mobilization of financial resources, and scaling up of effective biodiversity actions at the local and subnational levels. This collaborative approach is essential to achieving the EU's biodiversity targets and ensuring a more sustainable, resilient future for Europe's ecosystems. I hope, Kobe, that I have 1 minute more just to give you the example that we had managed to establish in Luxembourg, a very small country with only one large city of 140,000 inhabitants, being Luxembourg City itself, and all the others are more small municipalities, and quite a large number are rural municipalities. And the initiative, as Sharon said, the drivers are the cities and municipalities, evolved in Luxembourg 40 years ago by 10 municipalities saying we want to do something on the level of creating or restoring ecosystems or biotopes. And they got together saying small municipalities don't have the human resources, nor the machinery, nor the financial capacities. So if we gather together as 10 municipalities, we can achieve much more larger projects in restoring ecosystems. And by that, idea evolved to being nowadays covered throughout the whole 100 municipalities of Luxembourg, being in such collaborative associations. And the government of Luxembourg rapidly, very soon realized that this was the perfect instrument to mobilize also not governmental financial resources, but also mobilizing the local budget disposals of the municipalities, in saying by projects done by municipalities will be co-financed by 50 or even more percentage by the government. So that the money incentive from the government was, of course, the perfect incentive for municipalities to say, well, that's the ideal idea, to have financially modest budgetary means to give a disposal for biodiversity restoration projects. And it is a very positive success story. And if you want, I can give you, I mail you the project, and you're up to give it to anyone who wants to see what was this positive effect of this initiative, where you don't only have the money from the state money, governmental money, but also mobilizing the local budgets for these projects. Thanks.
Thank you, Robbie, and also thank you very much for sharing that very real and concrete example. We here in Africa know all about having to group cities together, some smaller cities together, to get to the scale that investors are even interested to talk to them, you know. So I think what you're doing there is certainly something that could be of real value, and we would love you to share that whole concept with us, so that we can share it with others. I think, you know, what we need to do here, we're forging partnerships and alliances across the world, and the big reason for that is that time is running out. We only have a few years left. We're on the brink. I mean, the US Secretary General said it just this week again, that the UN, you know, Antonio Guterres, talking in the climate context, but that we're on the brink of not having the opportunity to respond anymore, you know. So we need to learn from each other. We need to upscale, and sharing examples like this is what platforms like Cities with Nature and Regions with Nature and these sorts of global efforts are all about. So thank you for bringing that, and also for pointing out how important the legal instruments are that you are working with. And legal instruments, we know, legal reform, policy reform, that's a slow process in any one country, imagine within the EU. And thank you very much for the tenacity to see these processes through, to build the necessary will amongst the community within the EU at all levels of government, so that these processes can actually pave the way. And in many ways, the EU green reforms that are taking place there on such a consensus basis, you know, are inspiring to so many other parts of the world. So we take a lot from it, and we know it's dedicated hard work, years and years of diplomacy, and dedicated to hard work and making the argument, making the case for biodiversity at the subnational government level, in a way to support national governments and enable national governments to be ambitious in their goals as they should be. So we're now turning to a very important subnational government, which has a bigger economy than many of the United Nations parties at the negotiation table. So understanding the economy of scale, I think, is not a question for California. And it's also known as the Golden State. What many people don't know, that is also one of the most biodiverse states in the United States. But we all know that it is also understanding and grappling with this polycrisis that we find ourselves in. If you think about the climate crisis, if you think about everything that is happening there in terms of droughts, in terms of fires, etc., we really feel climate change at the community level across California, as in so many other parts of the world. So here I'm turning, and I'm very honored to introduce to you, I'm turning to Wade Crowfoot, who is the Secretary of Natural Resources of the state of California within the United States. And to Secretary Crowfoot, I'd like to ask, being one of the biggest economies in the world and one of the most biodiverse in the US, is this state, is California doing enough to increase our investment in biodiversity conservation, both at state level, within the context of states operating with ecosystems, and in the cities based in California? And what financial instruments exist to support biodiversity conservation and restoration? And how does that link to the climate work and the other agendas that are in a way cumulative and so interlinked, but could also be competitive? Secretary Crowfoot, I'm very pleased to hand the floor to you now. Thank you.
Kobe, thank you so much, and greetings, Sharon and Robbie and everybody joining here today. I'm coming to you from Sacramento, our capital city, on a cool fall morning. And it's actually, we celebrate California Biodiversity Day this week. We also celebrate International Biodiversity Day in the spring, but we actually have we created this California Biodiversity Week to further galvanize folks. And so right now, actually, as I speak, we have community groups across the state doing a community science blitz, where they're using the app iNaturalist, which is a free downloadable app to identify species like this, which is the Ocotillo. And I share this with you just to tell you that, we have a large desert region in California, and that plant usually looks like a bunch of dead sticks, but we just had this huge tropical storm come through and the desert is alive. So it's really energizing in California this week, given the California Biodiversity Day. I'll also say in California, we're really energized by the agreement that came together last December. We actually organized a delegation, almost 50 people large, including about 9 of our state legislators, to actually witness the work in Montreal and to make connection with other subnational governments, cities, provinces, states, because California is really, really prioritizing this. At the same time, I'll observe that we're almost a year in from that agreement, and it's all about action from the agreement. So I love the theme of this webinar series, which is agreement to action. So much can be discussed and negotiated about this sort of international governance and the flow of capital from nation states, developed nation states to developing nation states, and we are in full support of driving that as forward as possible. But I'll also say that that's not like our central. We don't have central influence on that. So then the question is, how are we driving forward on biodiversity in California? And really, Kobe, that's your question. From our perspective, if we're asking the rest of the world to actually make the Montreal Agreement real, then we have to do that within the borders of California. So our governor actually about 3 years ago made a commitment to 30 by 30, conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters. We established a really strong definition of what those protected lands and waters look like. And then we identified the gap that we need to fill. And that includes about 7 million acres of land, or almost 3 million hectares of land that we have to protect or better conserve than we are now. And we have to double the amount of protection and conservation in our state waters, which is our beaches up to 3 miles off the coast. So we have a lot of work cut out for us. I'm really excited to share that we're days away from our legislature potentially codifying that executive directive into law, that 30 by 30. So that's really exciting. So I'd say the first piece, to really galvanize finance across the world is subnational governments have to embrace our biodiversity targets as an absolute priority. You know, too often in the past, biodiversity has been sort of a nice to have, but not a have to have, given all that governments are struggling with. And so we're working to change that in California and make that every bit as important as other elements of climate action, other parts of our public health agenda, and almost treat it as, you know, natural infrastructure that we need to build. So I want to share a little bit about what we're doing on the finance side. I think Sharon made a really good point, or maybe you, Kobe, about the fact that let's not consider that, you know, biodiversity funding has to be a completely new, separate category of funding. From our perspective, we have, you know, large budgets across the world, even in subnational governments, and how do we orient those towards nature-based solutions, including, you know, conservation and habitat restoration and protection. From our perspective, you know, we have a state budget of over $200 billion a year. And so some portion of that has to go to what we know as biodiversity protection, but we can also call environmental conservation or nature-based solutions. So over the last few years, we've really challenged ourselves within our climate action agenda to have a key piece of that is nature focused. And so I'm pleased to share that we have allocated over the last 3 years, $1 billion US for what I'll call biodiversity protection, but we call environmental conservation. So that's funding for the acquisition of lands into public ownership for protection. That's funding for local groups that work with private landowners to conserve land through permanent easements. That's funding complementary measures to land protection like habitat connectivity. And so I can say that we are now spending far more than California has ever spent on this set of environmental conservation activities, and it's really exciting. I'll share that in the last month, we've just launched a $100 million program within that broader category, specifically to transfer funds to indigenous communities and our tribal governments in California. We know that 80% of the world's biodiversity is stewarded by indigenous peoples. And in California, historically, we've disconnected and disempowered our tribal partners from caring for nature. So we're working to redress that. And this $100 million program, which will start to get to tribes later this fall, is all about ancestral land return, building capacity of tribes, and establishing co-partnership or co-stewardship agreements with tribes. That's just one small piece of what we're able to fund, which we're really, really excited about. So there's that piece of, okay, how do we as subnational governments make sure that a portion of our existing budgets are shifted into nature? I think that's really, really important. And not only our climate budget, but from our standpoint, our budget to protect against water extremes as well as wildfire. I'll give you two examples. One is in California, we have major flooding risks in the winters with more and more extreme storms coming off the Pacific. We have this incredible nature-based solution of allowing for our rivers to overtop into historical floodplains at certain times of year. And by investing in the restoration of those seasonal floodplains, not only do we reduce downriver flooding threats, but we provide critical habitat to salmon and other migratory species of fish, as well as birds. It's a great example of how we're using flood funding or infrastructure funding to protect against flood for multi-benefit solutions that also benefit nature. Similarly, wildfire. You know, you mentioned this catastrophic wildfire that we in California, but so many other places are experiencing. What we realize is that we can reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire, restore the health of our landscapes in a way that benefits our biodiversity. So we're actually spending almost $3 billion on trying to get our hands around this wildfire resilience. And so we're trying to make sure as a large portion of that is into multi-benefit projects that improve landscape health and support biodiversity. So one big point is like, let's not, think about finding entirely new pots of money. Let's reorient or ensure that the funding that we have is actually going into nature. So we're really excited about that. Also, a lot of countries in the world and states and provinces mitigate infrastructure projects. In other words, if you're putting in a road or a transmission line, you need to provide environmental mitigation for the impacts of that infrastructure. We have very strong laws about that in California. Historically, we've done this sort of patchwork mitigation, super localized. We're shifting that to try to aggregate the funding for mitigation and do this large regional advanced mitigation, looking at habitat corridors, looking at climate refugia as our climate changes for biodiversity, and then really trying to leverage those mitigation dollars, which will be billions of dollars over decades, into big, smart biodiversity investments. Again, that's money that's going to get spent as mitigation to infrastructure anyways. Let's optimize it. We're also working with our counties, which is a political subdivision we have here in the United States, around their own planning. Specifically, we know we need to build more housing and infrastructure in California, but we also recognize that a lot of places are very sensitive environmentally. So we support a process called the Natural Communities Conservation Plan, or NCCP. And counties essentially undertake this planning and create like a red light, yellow light, green light for development. The red light is those areas of environmental sensitivity that they need to protect. And the green light is where they can streamline infrastructure development. That county planning is really helpful because it's driving development funding into the conservation of those red zones, those really sensitive areas. So that's another way that government can actually drive private finance into conservation. I'll say that philanthropy plays a really big role, and we shouldn't overlook that across the world. I know, for example, that the Nature Conservancy has been working with the government of Gabon on a debt for nature swap, and that recently was announced. So we should figure out how to work with our philanthropic partners globally. In California, a lot of the conservation that's happening is happening through like local nonprofit land trusts, for example. These are regionally based conservation organizations. So a lot of that state government funding is going to essentially into those organizations and paired with philanthropic funding. And then I also think, it's complicated across the world, but using our tax code to provide tax incentives for private investment into conservation makes sense. And then I think lastly, I'd say ecosystem services, how we, it continues to be a little elusive, but we need to continue to provide or identify monetary value of maintaining biodiversity, of sequestering carbon in our landscapes, in our forests. And if we're asking the developing world to protect and not, industrially develop those lands, we have to find those financing mechanisms. I guess, Kobe, final point I'd make, I was in China last week and I was in Australia last month because our governor is focused on establishing more subnational links on climate action. And I'll say that in both places, Australia with the governments of Queensland and New South Wales, and in China with Beijing and Shanghai and many of the provinces, biodiversity is brought up proactively by these subnationals and by us, as well as nature-based solutions. I've been doing this work for a couple of decades, and I can tell you when I was in China 10 years ago, that wasn't even part of the conversation. And now it is. So I'm really appreciative of the role that ICLEI plays and UNEP plays to bring us together. I really think that we have a great opportunity over the next couple of years to bring together the practitioners, the people in these governments that are making things happen on finance and on tangible projects. Let's come together and figure out ways to share best practices, support each other's efforts so we can move further and faster. And I guess last point is many of us will be at the COP in Dubai, the Conference of Parties for Climate Change, in December. And it seems like, hoping that ICLEI and partners that are joining here today can figure out how we lift the voice of biodiversity being not separate from climate action, but nature protection as integral to climate action. So thanks so much for the opportunity to share thoughts.
Thank you so much, Secretary. And, I must say, I'm so delighted that we are recording this session here for my own benefit as well, as well as for others to share it further later. because every one of you has given so many rich examples together here of what's moving and what's shaking. And there's a lot happening clearly in California this week, but I think every week. So thank you very, very much for those inputs. And I also want to congratulate you. California, of course, is also a partner exactly for the reasons you mentioned, to share the wonderful work that you're doing and to learn from others while you're doing it under the Regions with Nature umbrella. So we've got Cities with Nature and Regions with Nature as two global instruments, which are partnership instruments, UNEP, ICLEI, IUCN, TNC. So many of us are involved in creating these platforms so that regions can share and learn from each other and inspire each other at the technical level, as well as at the political level where it's needed, where we still need to convince some political leaders to take on a local action or subnational action around nature with the passion you do, Secretary. So thank you very much for all those examples. So many things stood out. But I just want to say the 30 by 30 target, when you started off talking, you know, you mentioned that your state adopted the 30 by 30 target. This is also adopted by the entire CBD parties. That's what, 196, 97 parties. Don't quote me on that. I'm not, Sharon, you can correct me there. But so basically all the countries around the world, except for a few, have adopted this target and committed to achieve that by 2030. 30% should be restored and protected of land and oceans. It cannot happen if it doesn't happen locally and in states. And what you've done is you've quantified how to achieve that. So I think, you know, this is the work that needs to happen now at subnational level at a very fast and rapid pace. How can we help our countries achieve the targets which they agreed on? Because if we do not come to the table as subnational and local governments, our national governments are not going to attain those targets. And they didn't put that 30 by 30 target out there for one or other reason, but to actually let us know this is what is needed for humanity to have a future on this planet, a quality of life future on this planet. And it goes hand in hand with addressing climate change. And we'll definitely see you at COP28 in Dubai, definitely. And thank you very much for committing to being there as well and working with ICLEI and others, C40 and others as we get there. So thank you very much for your words. Also, the very inspirational project you have with the indigenous communities, because we are all about communities. What you're doing this week, the Blitz, identifying, getting communities involved, engaged. These are all very important steps, but really reaching out to indigenous communities and respecting their relationship with nature. It's incredibly important across my continent here in Africa, but in so many other parts of the world, South America, everywhere, North America, everywhere. We really need to embrace a whole of community approach when we address these things. And thank you for showing us this leadership and inspiring us so much. And we will make sure that everything that you said today is actually already on the California profile in Regions with Nature, so that other regions around the world can see how you do it and learn from it. Just as Robbie, your fantastic example that you mentioned. I want to go back. We only have about 10 minutes left. So I want to ask you, each in the same order, Sharon, starting with you, but closing reflections as well at the end of your 2-minute statement, and just a quick question to prompt some of these statements, but you can also respond on anything that you've heard here today. I'd like to ask you, Sharon, is UNEP seeing enough traction from cities and subnational governments under the UN decade on ecosystem restoration? And if not, what from your experience are the main challenges, and what initiatives focus on financing ecosystem restoration at local and subnational level? If you just want to highlight some of the work you do, I know how much you do, and then also give us some closing thoughts while you're at it, because we'll move on from Robbie and then to Secretary Crowfoot from there. Thank you very much, Sharon. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Kobe. We are within UNEP, we are seeing a lot of traction from cities and subnational governments on the UN Decade on Ecosystems Restoration. The examples provided by Wade and Robbie are so inspiring. But is it enough? That's the question you asked me, is if we are seeing enough traction. The answer, unfortunately, still is no. And that's why we need California and Luxembourg to continue to inspire with their examples, using the UN Decade of Ecosystems Restoration as a platform. I'd like to point out here, because we're talking about the GBF and the implementation of the GBF, I cannot highlight enough the importance of cities, not only in terms of Target 12, but in so many targets within the GBF. We talk about coastal restoration, and a lot of the cities are in coastal areas. We talk about Target 16, for example, on sustainable consumption and food waste. That's going to happen. A lot of that is going to happen in urban areas. So when we think about GBF implementation and the importance and the urgency to get cities on board and to get cities to understand and to own the Global Biodiversity Framework, it's really, really important that that should be a core part of the advocacy that we are doing with cities and regions here today. So I would like to just congratulate you, Kobe, and your team for making the push in educating and in engaging people on the GBF implementation, because we need to move from the agreement to action for humanity's future.
Absolutely, Sharon, you said it. And for humanity's future, you know, the planet may survive, but will we? And if we do, how? You know, so I think these are big questions to answer, and the answer lies in nature. The answer lies in reconnecting us with nature. And I'm glad also that Secretary Crawford touched on the fact around health, because I think we've seen in the pandemic times when people were deprived of nature just how much we are actually part of nature, whether we know it or not, whether we live in big cities or in a very rural context. We need to engage with nature, and depriving us from it, even if it's just walking to your office in New York, in Manhattan, through a green leafy street, that puts you in touch with nature, and locking you up in your built environment, pushing nature out, is something that had a profound impact on the health and well-being, mentally, physically, spiritually, you know, in so many ways that I think we are yet to see the final impact of that. And our medical professionals are working on interesting studies in that regard. And ICLEI also embraces, of course, nature action, and everything should be nature net positive, but we also embrace the One Health concept very much. And it's all interlinked, isn't it? So, Robbie, quickly coming to you in our last 5 minutes that we've got, for 2 minutes or so, just describe to us, we know the EU is on the forefront of tackling climate change and pollution and so many other issues. Do you feel that nature is being mainstreamed? Do you feel that the concept of all actions should be nature net positive is gaining that traction within the EU, specifically when you think about looking at funding and opportunities and legal frameworks, etc., that enable local and subnational governments to make their contribution within the EU framework? And then also, Robbie, if you want to leave us with any closing remarks, you're welcome to. Thank you very much. And thank you, I must say, Councillor Beaver, for being there, doing what you're doing within the EU context. We all appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Kirby, for your kind words. And yes, it's my dada to fight for biodiversity. And for the moment, I'm a little bit worried because, especially in Europe, we're confronted with numerous crises, not to speak about the Ukraine war. And I had the bad feeling that the biodiversity matter, or nature matter, or climate change subject is going down in the popular meaning or awareness. And I think it's very crucial in this moment to say, and you just mentioned it during pandemic time, that we have to have our citizens behind us. As Sharon said, it are the cities that are the drivers. I would even say more. It's not the cities, it's the citizens that are the drivers. If we manage to have the large majority of citizens behind the subject of biodiversity and raising their awareness and comprehension of what is in stake with an intact or a restoration of ecosystems, then it's easy for politicians to react if the citizens are asking for it. So we have to make a huge effort in awareness raising and in information and giving all our citizens the knowledge why it is for their personal well-being and the personal advantage. It's not because some biologists want to save a bird or something. It's for the own health of our planet, but our own health. And if we succeed in this discussion or having this awareness with the citizens, everything will be much, much easier. And the Director Generals made the calculation that the return on invest for €1 is 8 to 38 euros as return on invest. So that's the argument to not only mobilize public money, but also private money. And I think in these days, all these two arguments should be stressed more than we do for the moment. So that's my final word to say, let's do it together with our citizens.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Robbie. It's fantastic to hear that calculation is happening and it's sinking in, you know, because often that is what the private sector understands, that's what politicians understand. We cannot completely put a financial value to nature. Of course, you know, there are arguments that one shouldn't only do that, but it certainly has a role, it certainly has a function to play, and we need to understand what the value is that that investments or projects take. And it's actually not a cost. It's actually ensuring your tomorrow, ensuring humanity's tomorrow and the future success of society of tomorrow. And I think that is the sort of language that we need to take to COP28. And I want to again emphasize that we will definitely, there is a Nature Day, and we definitely are already in very deep discussions with COP28 presidency, who are very committed to take the work forward. You know, maybe a decade or so ago, or less even, at the climate COPs, nature was not even really spoken of. And it's really all over the place this year. And already in Egypt, already in Madrid, we saw, you know, at the Fiji COP in Bonn, we already saw nature becoming more and more into the center space. And I think Dubai is going to be the moment where nature is front and foremost, also in the mindsets of people when they talk about climate. So we're looking forward to making sure that the collective voice of local and subnational governments are also there, but also that thrust around multi-level governance is brought forward. Secretary Crawford, thank you for staying with us. We know you've got an incredibly busy schedule this week, but I do want to give you the final word. One word of advice in a minute or two that we've got left here, from your perspective, from your rich experience, your enthusiasm. What would you say should we do collectively? What can we do? What should we do differently? How can ICLEI help? How can we all help together? And I just want to say also thank you very much for the inspirational work coming out of California. It's a pleasure to share it with the rest of the world. And it inspires everybody on this call, but it will go far beyond this call as well. So the final word is yours, Secretary.
Kobe, thanks so much. 2 quick points. One is to reinforce something that you all have said. It's not, you know, protecting nature from people. People are part of nature, and we have to help everybody understand that protecting nature, conserving nature is protecting ourselves. You know, sounds a little trite, but it's so critically important, because if it's, you know, biodiversity versus people will win in the political systems, you know, and the funds will go to them. So we need to make this connection, and we can continue to do that. Then I'll say, this is my dog enthusiastically chiming in, but I'll say this, which is, it's not binary. There's so much discouraging news about the environment, climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and at the same time, progress is being made. So I think we really need to key on that. Yes, we need to keep pressure on the international process to drive the funding transfers that are needed. Yes, we need to keep pressure on our nation states to do what they need to do. And we need to support each other on the subnational level, making progress. I'll give one last example, which is the gray wolf in the United States and the West was essentially made extinct 100 years ago. And it was carefully reintroduced in one of our national parks, Yellowstone National Park. And over 30 years, something incredible happened, which is the wolf pack spread out into Washington State, Oregon State, and then down into California. It's only been in Northern California. 2 weeks ago, we learned of the establishment of this native wolf pack in very far Southern California. Point being, nature is resilient. Nature comes back if we give it half a chance. So let's keep the pressure on and build momentum on the progress we're making.
Wow, fantastic. And thank you for sharing that example of the wolves. We saw nature just rebounding and coming back in so many wonderful ways during the pandemic. And let's not forget how easy it was in some instances just to give them a little bit of a window of opportunity. Here we had our penguins just flourishing in Cape Town, and so many other species as well. So thank you for sharing that with our Secretary. I want to thank all our speakers here today, but I also want to thank all our partners. ICLEI cannot do this alone as a network of cities and subnational governments. We work with so many others, and we really need to take, this is a time to take hands, to form partnerships, even if it's unusual partnerships with the insurance industry, with so many other private sector players, with so many other networks that are out there, initiatives. And I want to thank you everybody for attending this webinar. You can already see that you can register for the next one that will be taking this conversation further towards COP16. These biodiversity COPs are at least as important as the climate COPs. They don't happen every year, they happen every second year, but please register for these webinars so that we can keep the subnational momentum going towards COP16 after COP15, because it's now about action. It's from as we term these dialogues, it's all about from agreement to action. And the action happens, as we know best, locally, in our cities, in our towns, in our provinces, in our states. Thank you also to my team, the ICLEI team. You are the A team. You're doing very important work. And thank you to all our lovely partners that we work with and everybody that attended today. So for now, we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.